I played against two 1700 FIDE rated opponents, and of course a FIDE rated tournament. This was actually my first ever FIDE rated tournament. This was in Medellin a couple of months ago. I was really nervous. I could feel the grandmasters playing the ITT in the next room, but the games were absolutely crazy, full of amazing ideas. So let's jump straight into the games. In the first game, I had the white pieces against a 1775. I open up with, of course, d4 and c4, my go-to opening, and my opponent plays something that is really annoying for me. As soon as he went c5, I was like, this is gonna be not the best game I have played, but let's try. I go pawn to d5. This is the Benoni defense, by the way, pawn to c5. I go pawn to d5, and b5, just gambiting the pawn on the queen side of the board. I take the pawn, he gambits another pawn, I just take that one, and he takes with the bishop. Now I go knight to c3, pawn to d6, and pawn to e4. Of course, at this point, my opponent takes the bishop on f1. I have to take that, and I cannot castle anymore because I moved my king. Now, he goes pawn to g6. Of course, you can't really develop the bishop via this diagonal, so you have to develop it via g7. And I want to do the same thing. I want to fianchetto my king via g2. Well, I can't castle, so I'm going to manually castle, pawn to g3, king g2, and bring the rook out. He goes bishop g7, king to g2, he castles, and I go pawn to h3. Why do I do that? Because sometimes in the Benoni defense, in these type of positions, they like to go knight to g4 and knight to e5, and that's kind of uncomfortable. It's not a big deal, but I don't like it, so I went pawn to h3, preventing that idea. Now he goes queen to b6, putting a little bit of pressure on the pawn on b2. I go rook to e1, over defending the pawn on e4, so this knight can breathe a little bit. He goes rook to b8, putting even more pressure on the pawn on b2. Now I can't develop this bishop freely because that pawn would fall. So I go queen to c2, over defending the pawn on e4 and the pawn on b2 at the same time. Now he brings the knight out, opening up the diagonal of the bishop. Now I just go pawn to b3. This is not a great move. I realize that I'm weakening kind of a lot this diagonal, giving the bishop a lot more life. But there's no direct way of attacking this knight, so everything's good for now. He goes pawn to c4. This is the best engine move. I don't know why at this point it was really uncomfortable. Well, first of all, it is of course damaging my pawn structure. I have to respond to that. Yeah, I was really confused at the time. I didn't know what to do. I was thinking maybe bishop e3, maybe rook b1, which is probably what I should have done. But in the game, I went knight to a4. There are a lot of things happening here. First of all, I'm attacking this pawn twice. The queen is hanging, but my rook is also hanging. So there's a lot of things to calculate here. If he takes the rook, I will gladly take the queen. He went queen to b4. There's a better move. He could take the knight, and if I take that, he takes the rook on a1, and I'm losing. I'm down material. If you notice, he has 3 minor pieces, and I have 2 minor pieces. So I am down material. The problem is, before taking the rook, I can actually just go bishop to e3, attacking the queen. And if the queen moves somewhere funny, I can just take the rook. And now we are up material. He can take the rook on a1, of course. I will just take back, and we are up a pawn. This didn't happen in the game. Instead, my opponent went queen to b4, putting a little bit of pressure on the rook on e1. I have to be very careful about that. Now I get my rook out of danger. Remember that the rook was hanging on a1. Now he takes on b3, I take back, and I was nervous about this idea. Rook takes a4. If I take that, he can just take the rook on b1, because that is a free rook. I can just take with the queen and they just take back. But I have an intermediate move. I can just go bishop to d2, attacking the queen, connecting the rooks. That's the most important point. Now the queen has to move somewhere, and now we just take the rook. Now this rook is defended by its friend. So this didn't happen. Instead, in the game, my opponent went rook to c8, attacking my queen. I moved my queen out of danger, and he attacks my queen again. Completely forgetting about what's happening on the board, I took the knight on e5, hanging the rook on e1. At this point, I was like, damn, really? I'm just gonna lose this game so freaking early. I was really sad. I thought for like 15 minutes, just having a mental breakdown. I was just like, you know what? Let's just keep playing a little bit. Let's not resign just yet. It's really early. Nobody has left. Nobody has finished the game. I'm not gonna be the first one. So I went knight to c6, and at this point, both my opponent and I looked at each other's eyes at the same time and realized the best news in the world for me. The queen on e1 is actually trapped. That queen can't move anywhere. When I went knight to c6, I'm taking away the escape squares of the queen. The queen can't even go to c3 because of this knight. Can't go anywhere. The queen is trapped. We realized that at the same time. We both just like, and he was like, fuck. And I was like, fuck. We were really confused about what was happening here. So the best move is what my opponent did. He went rook takes this guy, and now the queen can escape, of course. But I can avoid that. I can just go bishop d2, which is what I did in the game. It's not a great move. The best move is actually just taking a rook, but I really wanted to take that queen. So he takes a rook on b1, I take back, and now he goes rook to a6, putting pressure on I don't even know what. I mean, this knight is defended. Now, I went queen to d3, activating my queen, pawn to h5, and bishop to c3, asking for some exchanges. I want things to get a little bit cleaner. This is actually a draw. Of course, this is only a draw if you're freaking Magnus Carlsen. If you're a normal human being, a 1700 like this guy, this is not a draw. You're losing. But by the engine and by the top players, this is an easy draw. My opponent takes on c3. I take back with the knight. Rook to b6, putting pressure on the pawn on b3. I just go knight to b5, asking for my opponent to go rook to b8, putting pressure on the knight. Now I can just go knight to d4, defending this guy 2 times. Now he brings the knight into the game. I went pawn to f3, which is not a move I'm really proud of. I'm just boxing my king behind the pawns. But I really want to give this pawn some defense, and I want to move my queen somewhere. I don't want to stay defending this pawn with the queen the whole time. So my opponent went knight to d7, of course, with the idea of going either knight to c5 or knight to e5. I just bring my queen out to activate my queen via g5 or h6. He goes knight to c5, putting a lot of pressure on this pawn. I just attack the rook on c8, and my opponent takes the pawn on b3. He told me after the game that he miscalculated something here. He thought that he would get here faster. Of course, now I can just take the rook on b8, and now that is not possible. He has to take back, and now I just activate my queen. Again, this is a draw if you play absolutely perfect. This guy is 1700. I know he's not going to play perfect. He's going to, you know, mess it up at some point. He goes rook to b7, defending the pawn that I was attacking. I go g4. He takes on g4. I take back with the queen. Gives me a check. I just move forward. Rook to b1. Of course, he wants to trick me into taking my queen. I just give a check first, and then I attack the pawn on d6. If you take my pawn, then your pawn is not defending the knight anymore, and I can just take it. My opponent, of course, realized that, and he just went rook to b3. And now I go queen to e8, putting now pressure on the pawn on e7. Now he takes on e5 first. I take the pawn on e7. Knight to e4 with a check. I cannot take that knight because the pawn is pinned. So I go backwards. He gives me a check. I go back. And he goes knight to f6, putting pressure on the pawn on d5. Now I go king to e1. The problem is if I take this pawn, which looks like a free pawn, he can just go rook to b5, pinning this one. Attacked by the knight and attacked by the rook. I really don't like this, so I went king to e1 instead. He still goes rook to b5, but the problem is I can just push that pawn now. Rook to d5, now attacking the pawn from the back. Pawn to h4, rook goes back. And I wanted to trick my opponent into taking the pawn on f3, so I can just get my king closer a little bit. And this is kind of what happened. King to e2, now I'm attacking the rook. He goes back, but I can just take the pawn on e4. Oh shit, oh no, my queen. With a check and with a check to my queen, that's really not a problem. I calculated all of this. I can just take the pawn. He takes back with the knight and pawn to d7, and it is impossible to stop the promotion. Now he gives me a check. I just move my king out of the way, and I make a queen. Gives me another check, and my opponent is trying to hold, now attacking my queen. I just get my queen out of danger. Knight to f8. I get my king closer. Knight goes back. Pawn to h5. I give a check, and then I'm going to take the pawn on h5. My opponent prevents that, but I go king to f6, now getting my king closer, getting closer to checkmate as well. Knight to e8, attacking my king. The king gets closer, and I pin the knight, and then it is impossible to stop checkmate, and my opponent resigned the game. Super interesting win. I thought I hanged my rook on e1. I kind of did, but then I got super lucky. I realized that, my opponent realized that, and well, a win is a win, so what can you do? And now we jump straight into the second game. In this second game, I'm playing a 1752, and in this game, I played my first ever official brilliant in a FIDE rated tournament. I have the black pieces. My opponent goes with the London system. I go with my regular setup. I play this online as well. This is what I play always against the London, bishop d6. I take the bishop on f4, queen to d6 very quietly, attacking the pawn on f4. He goes pawn to g3, defending the pawn. Pawn to c5, getting a lot more space in the center, so I can go next knight to c6. Now my opponent goes c3, solidifying the pawn structure, and I guess finishing up the structure of the London. I just develop my knight. He takes on c5, I take back. knight to b6, and before I castle, be careful, my queen is hanging, so I go queen to b6 first. He develops the bishop, he wants to castle as well. I just castle, he goes queen to e2. Okay, very interesting. Now I don't know if he wants to castle long, he wants to castle short. He has both possibilities now. I just developed my bishop via d7 and he goes pawn to g4. Okay, let's think for a second. I have all my pieces developed, all of them. My rooks are connected, my king is castled, everything is great for me. Now let's look at my opponent for a minute. His pieces are developed, his rooks are not connected, his king is not castled, his king is in the middle, and the queen is in front of the king. And he's throwing an attack at me. There's something not right here. So, that's a free pawn, by the way. I can just take that pawn, but that will be opening up the file for his rook. I want to open up the center because the king is in the center. So I go pawn to e5. Now I'm the one sacrificing a pawn, but it doesn't matter because I'm opening up the center, which is what I want to do. He takes the pawn, I take back, takes my knight, and I take now on g4. Now he's very happy at this point. I open up the g file, so of course he wants to attack that file. Rook to g1, that is a blunder. Let me tell you why. Now I can just take the pawn, and that is my first brilliant, the first official brilliant I have ever played. Knight takes e5. Oh shit, my knight is not defended by anyone. Well, if you take that knight, which is what my opponent did for my luck, I calculated all of this, it was very easy. The king's in the center. There's not a lot to calculate. You just open everything up. Don't hesitate. Open it, sacrifice whatever needs to be sacrificed as long as you open up the center. Now, he's threatening checkmate in one move. The problem is, I have said this now 20 times in this video. The king's right here. So can we just pin the queen? No, at least, well, if you do that, he has rook takes g7. Remember, he cannot take with the queen's pinned, so he can't even move it. Rook takes g7. After king to h8, he has rook takes h7 with a check. The rook is defended by the bishop. And after king to g8, there's rook to h8, and that is checkmate. The rook is defended, I can't escape, that is checkmate. But there's a smart way of doing this. Don't use this rook, use the other one. Same thing, he can't move the queen, it is pinned. If he moves this rook, this is what my opponent did in the game, rook takes g7. Now I can just escape via f8. I couldn't do this before because there was a rook right here, but now I can do it. I take right here, the queen is pinned, he's losing the queen, but he went rook to g5. And look at this, look at that queen. Whenever you find a good move, you always try to find something better. There's always something better. I went pawn to f6. Beautiful fork. Both the rooks and the queen are attacked. You cannot take this pawn. Same thing. In this position, my opponent took the rook on e8 to ease things up a little bit. I take with the rook, that's a check. And now he goes king to d2. Getting out of that check. I could just take the rook, but remember what I just told you 20 seconds ago. Find always a better move. Before taking the rook, I just take the pawn on f2 with a check. Checkmate is coming in a couple moves, and at this position, my opponent resigned the game. These games were from round number 1 and round number 3. I didn't even play round number 2. I got late because they changed the schedule last minute and I didn't even realize that. But hey, 2 wins against 2 1700s, you cannot ask for a better start of a tournament. I really hope you learned something out of these 2 games. I hope you enjoy them. And if you want more games like this, make sure you like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next game.